At its peak, the Royal Navy had over 700 ships at sea and more than 140,000 men to crew them. A single ship of the line carried 600 oak trees in its hull, 26 miles of rope in its rigging, and enough iron to break any vessel that came within range. France had better forests, more coastline, a larger population, and a state that poured money directly into shipbuilding. Spain controlled an empire. The Dutch had been the finest maritime traders in Europe for a century. None of them won. Britain's forests were largely gone by the time serious naval expansion began, stripped across centuries for farmland, charcoal, and construction. Its parliament fought naval budgets as a matter of principle. Its treasury carried a national debt that would have bankrupted most governments on the continent. Yet by every material measure, it should have lost the competition before it began. It didn't. And the reason why is not what most people assume. England did not begin with a navy in any meaningful sense. For most of its medieval history, when a king needed ships, he hired them, from merchants, from the Cinque Ports, from wherever they could be found. And when the campaign ended, the ships went home. There was no standing fleet, no permanent infrastructure, no institutional memory from one generation to the next. While France was building properly equipped dockyards at Rouen in the 14th century, England had nothing comparable. The sea was a thing England used occasionally, not a domain it controlled. Henry VIII changed that, at least in principle. He inherited 7 small warships from his father and spent heavily to build more. In founding the Royal Dockyards at Portsmouth and Deptford, creating an administrative structure around the fleet, and launching ships large enough to dominate the Channel. By the time he died, England had a standing navy for the first time, funded from the proceeds of dissolved monasteries and currency debasement, which gave it a distinctly fragile financial foundation from the start. The ships were real. The money behind them was borrowed time. The problem that would follow England for the next century was not ambition, but consistency. Navies required sustained investment across decades. Ships rotted, crews dispersed, knowledge evaporated. A fleet that cost a fortune to build could become useless in a generation without continuous expenditure. English monarchs after Henry lurched between naval ambition and fiscal reality, sometimes building, more often neglecting, never quite solving the basic question of how to pay for the thing permanently. By the early 17th century, James I's reign had produced a fleet of roughly 30 aging warships, undermanned and riddled with corruption, barely adequate for anti-piracy duties in the Channel during summer months. Charles I attempted to break that cycle, but in doing so, he cracked the country instead. To fund a serious shipbuilding program without parliamentary approval, he revived an ancient medieval tax called ship money, levied traditionally on coastal counties in times of war, and extended it inland in peacetime as a permanent annual impost. The country did not accept it quietly. A Buckinghamshire landowner named John Hampden refused to pay and took his case to court. He lost by the narrowest of margins, 7 judges to 5. But the political damage was far greater than the verdict. The attempt to finance a navy outside Parliament had made the navy itself a symbol of royal tyranny. It was a profound irony. The institution that would eventually make Britain supreme had, in its early decades, nearly torn the Constitution apart. When the Civil War came, it came partly because of the Navy, and the Navy's future would be shaped by what followed. Parliament won. The king was executed, and the Commonwealth that emerged from the wreckage faced a simple choice: build a proper fleet or be destroyed by one. The Dutch were the greatest maritime power in Europe. Their merchant fleet numbered 10,000 vessels. England's barely reached 1,000. The commercial rivalry between the two nations was heading toward war, and England had almost nothing to fight it with. What Cromwell's Commonwealth did next was decisive and rarely given its due weight. Between 1649 and 1654, it authorized the construction of 40 new purpose-built warships, heavy, heavily armed, designed specifically for fleet combat rather than merchant escort. A 15% tax on merchant shipping paid for it. The ships were built quickly, funded consistently, and organized under a new generation of commanders who understood sea warfare as a discipline, not a gentleman's adventure. Robert Blake, the admiral who led them, had never been to sea before his 40s. Within a decade, he was the finest fleet commander in Europe. The First Anglo-Dutch War, which ran from 1652 to 1654, was the proving ground. The fighting was savage, fought at close range across the English Channel and the North Sea, with neither side able to establish a clear advantage until the English tactical system, the line of battle, ships firing broadsides in disciplined sequence, ground the Dutch down through 3 major engagements in 1653. England won, not through superior seamanship or tradition, but through institutional organization applied to naval combat for the first time. The lesson was duly noted, though it would be forgotten and relearned more than once before the century was out. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 brought the monarchy back, but did not unwind what the Commonwealth had built. The fleet remained state property. The dockyards kept working. The officer structure that had begun to professionalize under Blake continued its evolution, to now absorbing a generation of gentlemen officers alongside the working seamen who had risen through the Commonwealth Navy. Samuel Pepys, appointed to the Navy Board in 1660, found an institution that was powerful in theory and chaotic in practice. Contracts unpaid, ships rotting at their moorings, victualling riddled with fraud. He spent the next 2 decades methodically dismantling the corruption and replacing it with something resembling an administrative system. By the end of the 17th century, England had still not resolved the central tension of its naval ambition. Parliament held the purse, and Parliament was suspicious of standing military forces of any kind. The Bill of Rights of 1689 had formalized that suspicion into constitutional law, prohibiting a standing army in peacetime without parliamentary consent. The navies were treated more favorably. They were less frightening to a parliament that feared military coups, but the money was never guaranteed and never generous. What England had going into the 18th century was not a settled naval system. It had an argument about a naval system conducted in dockyard offices and in parliamentary committees. And out of that argument, slowly and with enormous friction, the greatest war fleet in history would be built. A ship of the line was a forest consumed and reassembled. A single 74-gun warship, the workhorse of the fleet, required around 3,000 loads of timber, the yield of roughly 2,000 mature oaks. Larger first-rate ships demanded considerably more. The HMS Victory, launched in 1765, consumed somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 trees. The oak had to be old, so slow-grown and gnarled in the right ways. English hedgerow oak was prized specifically because its naturally curved grain produced the internal structural members, the knees and compass timbers, that held a hull together under the violence of broadside fire and North Atlantic storms. Straight-grained northern oak could plank a hull. Only English oak could give it its skeleton. The problem was that England was running out of it. The process had been going on for centuries. Woodland cleared for agriculture, burned for charcoal, felled for construction, grazed to exhaustion by livestock. But naval demand accelerated the depletion with particular force from the mid-17th century onward. A naval survey of the New Forest in 1707 counted 12,476 trees fit for shipbuilding. A century earlier, in 1608, the same forest had held 123,927. The Great Storm of 1703 had taken 4,000 new forest oaks in a single night. What remained was insufficient, and what grew to replace it would take 100 years to reach the size a shipwright needed. The Navy's response to its own forests was to mark them. Surveyors moved through the royal woodlands, stamping suitable trees with the king's broad arrow, 3 hatchet cuts forming a rough arrowhead, which legally designated them as crown property and made their felling without license a finable offense. In the New Forest, these marked trees stood apart from ordinary woodland, watched and recorded. It was a conservation measure, but it was also an admission. The domestic supply was no longer adequate, and what remained had to be rationed. The oak of England was now a strategic resource to be managed, not a material to be assumed. Britain turned first to the Baltic. Norway supplied the bulk of its timber imports through most of the 18th century. 4/5 of all Danish-Norwegian goods entering England between 1755 and 1764 were timber. The eastern Baltic, from Poland across to Russia, provided great masts, spruce, and fir. Sweden controlled the strait separating it from Denmark and understood its position perfectly, using access to the timber trade as diplomatic leverage throughout the century. By the late 1700s, the Navy required 50,000 loads of oak per year just to keep its dockyards operating, nearly a quarter of the entire country's timber consumption, and the Baltic supplied a substantial portion of that figure. The Baltic dependency had 2 serious weaknesses, and the first was economic. Britain ran a persistent trade deficit with the entire region, unable to export enough goods to cover its timber purchases, making up the shortfall in bullion. Mercantilist economists found this intolerable. The second was strategic. The Baltic was politically volatile. The straits could be closed, trade routes could be severed. An enemy controlling the Danish coast could, in theory, throttle the Navy's timber supply at a single choke point. This was not a theoretical concern. 3 armed confrontations over Baltic access erupted between 1800 and 1815 in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon's continental system pushed most of the timber ports beyond reach, and the Navy suddenly found itself scrambling for alternatives. The colonies offered one. New England's white pine was the finest mass timber in the world, taller and straighter than anything the Baltic produced, and growing in forests that had never been touched. A mature eastern white pine could reach 150 feet with a trunk 6 feet across. Ships from the Baltic could make several return voyages a year. Ships from New England could make 1 or 2. The distance made colonial timber expensive and logistically difficult on a routine basis, but for mass specifically, the quality was unmatched. The Crown moved to lock it down. In 1691, the revised Massachusetts Bay Charter embedded a mast preservation clause in its final paragraph, reserving every tree of 24 inches diameter or more for the Royal Navy and forbidding colonists to fell them without license on penalty of £100 per tree. So the colonists were not cooperative. The King's broad arrow marked the best trees in a forest settler families needed for building, fuel, and commerce. Surveyors who arrived to mark and protect the Crown's timber were frequently obstructed, their marks obliterated, the protected trees quietly felled and processed before any one official could arrive to count stumps. The resentment ran deep. In 1772, a group of mill owners in Weir, New Hampshire, refused to pay fines for processing marked white pine and assaulted the sheriff and his deputies sent to arrest them, flogging each man once with a pine switch for every log that had been confiscated. The episode, known as the Pine Tree Riot, was small in scale and largely forgotten in the shadow of events that followed. But it captured something real. The Navy's hunger for timber was already generating political friction in the colonies decades before tea entered the picture. The search for alternatives went further still. India offered teak, denser than oak, more resistant to rot, almost immune to the shipworm that bored through European hulls in tropical waters. By the early 19th century, the Navy was commissioning ships from the Bombay dockyards, where Indian teak and local labor could be combined under British supervision at a fraction of the cost of home construction. Ukraine, Poland, and Russia supplied planking. As Canada was gradually developed as a mass source to relieve Baltic dependency, Canadian timber exports to Britain more than tripled between 1807 and 1809 after a 275% levy was placed on Baltic imports to make the transatlantic trade economically viable. Britain was not simply buying timber, it was building a global supply chain with strategic redundancy built into every link. The diplomatic dimension of timber never left the Foreign Office's attention. By the 18th century, British envoys to the Baltic states carried instructions not only to secure access for British merchants, but to deny that same access to France. The objective was asymmetric: keep the supply flowing to Portsmouth and Plymouth while ensuring that Brest and Toulon had to work harder, pay more, and travel further for the same materials. Thus, it worked imperfectly. France had its own Atlantic forests and Adriatic connections, but it added friction to French naval construction at every stage, slowing programs and raising costs during precisely the decades when both navies were expanding hardest. Parliament eventually turned to legislation. The Preservation of Timber Trees Act of 1766 and a follow-up act of 1772 extended protections to smaller trees and formalized the conservation framework for naval woodland. The new forest was enclosed in sections to prevent grazing and allow young oaks to establish. Plantation programs laid down timber that would not be ready for a shipwright's adze for 100 years. Is a frank acknowledgement that the Navy's current demand could not be met from current growth, and that the problem had to be managed across timescales longer than any single administration's tenure. It was not a solution. It was a managed deterioration, handled with enough institutional foresight to prevent immediate collapse. The timber problem never went away. It was managed, routed around, deferred, and displaced to the Baltic, to New England, to Canada, to India. But it was never solved by any domestic policy. What Britain had instead was a system flexible enough to absorb the constraint. When one source closed, another opened, not by accident, but because the Navy Board, the Foreign Office, and an extensive network of merchants and contractors had spent decades building the relationships and infrastructure that made substitution possible. France faced the same physical scarcity and lacked most of that infrastructure. Spain faced it and had an empire, but could not organize the supply chain efficiently enough to feed its yards on time. The timber problem in the end was less about oak than about institutional capacity. And that was the one resource Britain consistently refused to run short of. If you stood at the gates of Portsmouth Dockyard in 1800 and looked inward, you were looking at the largest industrial complex in the world. Not the largest in England, not the largest in Europe, the largest anywhere. Nearly 8,000 men worked inside its walls: shipwrights, rope makers, caulkers, sailmakers, blacksmiths, the riggers, clerks, and laborers, drawing wages from a single institution and reporting each morning to the sound of a muster bell on a wrought iron mast that still stands in the yard today. The dockyard had its own bakeries, its own breweries, its own water supply, its own internal hierarchy of trades, and its own culture so distinct from the surrounding town that workers built entire communities around its gates. Portsmouth was not unique in its scale. It was simply the largest of 6 Royal Dockyards operating simultaneously on the English coast. Chatham sat on the Medway, the home of the fleet for most of the 17th century and still a major shipbuilding yard when the Medway silted and the strategic focus shifted west. Plymouth, known from 1824 as Devonport, guarded the western approaches and maintaining the western squadron that held the channel against France during the long years of war. Deptford and Woolwich lined the Thames, aging by the late 18th century but still active, their position close to London's merchants and the Tower's ordnance stores giving them a utility that outlasted the silting river. Sheerness, at the mouth of the Medway, watched the Thames estuary. Together, the 6 yards formed a network with no rival in Europe. The yards had been accumulating infrastructure since Henry VIII founded the first of them. Dry docks, enclosed basins that could be drained so a hull sat exposed on wooden blocks above the mud, were the essential technology. Without them, a ship needing hull repairs had to be careened, dragged onto a beach, rolled onto her side, and worked on while the tide permitted. Thus, a dry dock allowed the whole process in a controlled environment, repeatedly, in any weather, on ships too large to careen safely. Portsmouth had the world's first purpose-built dry dock, constructed in 1495. By the Napoleonic Wars, the yard had expanded to dozens of dry docks, building slips, wet basins, storehouses, and workshops. The whole complex having more than doubled in size since the beginning of the 18th century. The workforce that filled these yards was enormous by any prior standard. In 1694, Chatham alone employed 1,400 men at a time, when the largest textile mill in England held perhaps 50. The dockyards were not merely large, they were categorically different from anything else in the economy. They operated on a scale that the private sector would not reach until the railways. They maintained permanent workforces through peacetime at a deliberate loss, keeping more men employed than strictly necessary, so that when war came, the surge capacity was already trained. Chatham introduced a pension scheme for yard workers in the later 18th century, a benefit rare enough in the broader economy to make dockyard employment one of the most stable working lives available to a man in Georgian England. The trades inside the yards were organized with a precision that prefigured modern industrial management. Shipwrights shaped and fitted the timber structure of a hull. Caulkers drove oakum, twisted hemp fiber, into the seams between planks and sealed it with pitch to make the hull watertight. Rope makers worked in long, narrow buildings called rope walks, with twisting hemp fibers by machine into the miles of cordage a single warship required. Sailmakers cut and stitched acres of canvas. Riggers assembled and fitted the standing and running rigging that operated every sail and gun. Each trade had its own hierarchy, its own apprenticeship system, its own piece rate structures, and its own institutional knowledge passed from master to apprentice across generations. A shipwright's son often became a shipwright. The dockyard absorbed and transmitted craft knowledge in a way no private yard could replicate at the same volume. The yards were also sites of continuous technological investment, a point that distinguishes them sharply from the image of conservative admiralty bureaucracy. Samuel Bentham, appointed Inspector General of Naval Works in 1795, last arrived at Portsmouth with a brief to modernize and a willingness to act on it. He introduced steam power to the yard's machinery, installed new sawmills, deepened basins, and began the process of mechanizing components that had always been made by hand. It was Bentham who provided the institutional receptivity that made the next step possible. That next step was the block mills, and it changed manufacturing history. A single ship of the line needed roughly 1,000 wooden pulley blocks of various sizes, the sheaved fittings through which running rigging was threaded to operate sails and guns. The Navy required over 100,000 of them per year. They had always been made by hand, by skilled craftsmen working individually with inconsistent quality and unreliable delivery. In 1802, a French engineer named Marc Brunel brought the Admiralty a proposal for a set of machines that would automate the entire process. By 1808, 45 all-metal machines installed in a purpose-built mill at Portsmouth, powered by steam and operated by 10 unskilled men, were producing 130,000 blocks a year. 10 men had replaced 110. The capital cost was recovered within 3 years. The Portsmouth block mills were the world's first steam-powered production line, and they were built not for a textile entrepreneur in Lancashire, but for the Royal Navy. The strategic importance of what was happening in the yards extended far beyond their walls. Thus, each yard sat at the center of a supply network that drew materials from across the known world and processed them into finished warships with a consistency no rival could match. Timber arrived by sea from the Baltic, the Americas, and eventually India, unloaded at the yard's wharves, stacked in massed ponds to season, and moved through the sawmill, the frame shop, the building slip, and the dry dock in a sequence that was never quick but was rarely interrupted. Iron for fittings came from the Midlands, hemp for rope came from Russia, canvas for sails was woven in Dorset and Suffolk. The yards were the fixed points in a supply chain of continental span. France had dockyards. Brest, Toulon, and Rochefort were substantial establishments with skilled workforces and long histories. What France lacked was the sustained capital investment across peacetime that would have kept those yards at the frontier of capability. French naval construction lurched with royal finance, ambitious during periods of reform, neglected during fiscal crises, and repeatedly disrupted by the political upheavals of the century. Brest expanded impressively in the 1780s under the reforming minister de Castries, but the Revolution of 1789 gutted its skilled workforce, drove off its experienced officers, and dismantled the administrative structures that had kept it functioning. By the time Napoleon rebuilt French naval ambitions, the yards were technically capable but institutionally depleted. Experience, like timber, takes decades to grow. The men who built and repaired the ships lived in the shadow of the yards in a way that shaped entire towns. Portsmouth expanded so quickly around its dockyard in the early 18th century that it burst through the old town walls, generating a new settlement called Portsea to house the overflow. Chatham's workers filled the villages along the Medway Valley. Plymouth Dock, its very name reflecting the dockyard's total dominance over the settlement, grew from a few houses in 1690 to a town of tens of thousands by 1800, its economy almost entirely dependent on naval expenditure. These were not ordinary company towns. They were communities where 3 or 4 generations of the same family might have worked the same trade inside the same walls, where the rhythm of the working day was set by the dockyard bell, and where a man's entire social world was structured around his trade and his yard. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the 7 home dockyards employed nearly 16,000 people. The number understates the system's reach because it excludes the private yards that took Navy contracts, the ordnance establishments that stored and supplied the fleet's guns and powder, and the victualling yards that fed 140,000 men at sea. The Royal Dockyards were the visible core of an industrial system whose true extent was national. No French minister standing in Brest or Toulon in 1805 was looking at anything comparable, not in scale, not in continuity, not in the depth of accumulated skill that the British yards had been building, trade by trade and generation by generation. Since Henry VIII ordered the first dry dock dug at Portsmouth 3 centuries before. A warship of the line cost between £40,000 and £100,000 to build depending on its rate, before a single man was paid or a single barrel of provisions loaded. Fitting it out, victualling it for a cruise, and paying its crew for a year of service added considerably more. Multiply that across a fleet of 140 ships of the line, plus frigates, sloops, bomb vessels, transports, and the administrative infrastructure ashore, and the numbers become almost incomprehensible for the era. The 7 Years' War cost Britain roughly £160 million over 7 years. The Napoleonic Wars, fought across 2 decades, cost over £1 billion in total, approximately twice the entire annual output of the British economy at the time. Now, the question of how Britain paid for any of it, let alone all of it, starts with a catastrophe that took place in 1667. In June of that year, a Dutch fleet sailed up the River Medway, broke the chain that had been stretched across the water to protect the English anchorage, and destroyed or captured 15 warships at their moorings, including the Royal Charles, the flagship of the fleet. It was the worst naval defeat in English history, and it happened because Charles II had run out of money. Unable to fund a full season of active operations, he had laid the fleet up and paid off its crews. The Dutch attacked while the peace negotiations were still underway. The lesson was unambiguous. A navy that could not be continuously funded was a navy that could not be defended. And England needed a fundamentally different way to finance its military. And the solution came from a combination of constitutional revolution and financial innovation. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 was the turning point, when William III replaced James II and accepted a constitutional settlement that placed Parliament firmly in control of taxation and expenditure. England acquired something no absolute monarchy in Europe possessed: a government whose debts were underwritten by the collective credibility of Parliament itself. Previous English kings had borrowed as individuals, and lenders charged accordingly: high rates, short terms, and constant uncertainty about repayment. Parliament could not be imprisoned or assassinated like a king, could not unilaterally repudiate its obligations without destroying its own authority. It was populated by the very merchants and landowners who stood to lose most from a default. The constitutional settlement of 1688 made borrowing reliable for the first time. 6 years later, in 1694, that reliability was institutionalized. England needed £1.2 million to rebuild its navy for the ongoing war against Louis XIV's France. A Scottish financier named William Paterson proposed the solution. A group of private investors would lend the full amount to the government at 8% interest, and in return, they would be incorporated as the Bank of England, with the right to issue notes and conduct banking business under Royal Charter. The proposal was adopted. The subscription was fully taken up in 11 days. The Bank of England opened its doors on Threadneedle Street, and England's financial revolution began in earnest. The bank did not simply lend money, it transformed the nature of government credit. Because the bank always met its obligations on schedule, a discipline that became its defining institutional characteristic, lenders learned to trust it, and the interest rate they demanded for government debt fell steadily across the following decades. By the mid-18th century, Britain was borrowing at 3%. France, which continued to borrow the old way, through private intermediaries, tax farmers, and royal decree, was paying anywhere from 6 to 12% and defaulted periodically regardless. The gap in borrowing costs was a permanent structural advantage that compounded across every war and every shipbuilding program of the century. The mechanism worked through what became known as the funded national debt. Rather than treating each loan as a personal obligation to be repaid quickly, Parliament converted government borrowing into long-term bonds, perpetual annuities that paid regular interest indefinitely and could be bought and sold on the open market like any other security. Investors did not need to wait for repayment. They could simply sell their bonds to someone else. The secondary market for government debt, centered in London's coffee houses and later in the formal exchanges, was deep and liquid. Money flowed into government bonds from across Europe, including from Dutch and Jewish merchant networks who trusted British institutional stability more than any continental sovereign. By the mid-18th century, roughly 1/5 of British government debt was held by foreign investors. So Parliament's role in all of this was not merely passive. The constitutional requirement that all taxation and borrowing be approved by Parliament transformed naval finance from a royal prerogative into a national commitment. When Parliament voted naval estimates, the annual budget for ships, men, and stores, it was in effect pledging the taxable capacity of the entire country behind the program. Merchants who held government bonds knew that Parliament had both the legal authority and the political incentive to keep the tax revenues flowing that serviced those bonds. It was a self-reinforcing system. Parliamentary control made debt credible. Credible debt enabled large-scale borrowing funded the Navy, and the Navy protected the commercial interests of the very men sitting in Parliament. The circle closed on itself neatly. The contrast with France could not have been more stark. France had a larger economy, a larger population, and a richer tax base than Britain throughout the 18th century. Its GDP was roughly 3 times larger in 1789. Yet France could never sustain naval expenditure at British levels across the cycle of war and peace without facing fiscal breakdown. The reason was structural. The French state depended on tax farming. Private contractors who purchased the right to collect taxes in advance and then extracted as much as possible from the population, keeping a substantial portion for themselves. The system was opaque, inefficient, and deeply resistant to reform. The French nobility were largely exempt from direct taxation. Reform attempts were blocked by the parlements and the provincial law courts, whose members had purchased their offices and had every incentive to preserve the system that protected their investment. Each of France's major wars left its treasury more damaged than the last. The War of the Spanish Succession under Louis XIV accumulated debts so vast that the crown's total financial liabilities by 1720 had risen to an estimated 2.2 billion livres, a nine-fold increase over the figure at Colbert's death in 1683. John Law's Mississippi scheme, constructed precisely to manage this debt mountain by converting royal obligations into joint stock shares, collapsed catastrophically in 1720, wiping out the savings of thousands and destroying what nascent faith in paper credit the French public had ever possessed. When Britain's South Sea bubble burst in the same year, Parliament managed the crisis, decompensated investors, and preserved the Bank of England's credibility intact. France had no equivalent institution to perform that function, and the damage to French public finance lasted for decades. William Pitt the Younger, who became Prime Minister in 1783 at the age of 24, understood the relationship between credit and sea power, as well as any minister in British history. Inheriting a government still paying off the debts of the American War, he set about restoring financial confidence with a sustained program of fiscal reform. He established the Sinking Fund in 1786, a dedicated mechanism for paying down the national debt, and consolidated the revenue accounts to improve transparency. He lowered customs duties selectively to reduce smuggling and increase actual tax receipts. And he introduced income tax in 1798 as an emergency war measure, the first time in British history that income itself, rather than land or consumption, had been taxed directly. The measures worked well enough that when the Napoleonic Wars began in earnest, Britain could borrow freely and cheaply to fight them. By the time Nelson's fleet sailed for Trafalgar, Britain's national debt stood at roughly £500 million, an extraordinary sum that would not be paid off in full until 2015. It was also, in a fundamental sense, the price of the Navy. Every ship on the water, every barrel of salt beef, every coil of rope in the dockyards had been financed through a chain of credit that ran from the Navy Board through the Bank of England to the thousands of investors who held government bonds in their strongboxes. France had spent comparable sums across the same decades, but without the institutional architecture to borrow cheaply, consistently, and at scale, it could never convert spending into sea power with the same efficiency. Britain did not simply outspend its rivals, it outfinanced them. And the difference between those two things decided the century. Behind every warship that sailed from Portsmouth or Plymouth lay a world of private enterprise that the Navy could neither fully control nor do without. Rope had to be twisted, sails cut and stitched, guns cast, biscuit baked, beef salted, beer brewed, and thousands of casks coopered to hold it all. The Royal Dockyards handled some of this in-house, but the scale of the fleet's requirements far exceeded what any state institution could manage alone. From the mid-17th century onward, the Navy ran on contracts, sealed tenders submitted by private merchants and manufacturers who agreed to supply specified quantities of specified goods at a fixed price over a fixed term. The system was imperfect, often contentious, and occasionally corrupt. It also fed 140,000 men at sea and kept several hundred warships operational across 2 decades of near-continuous war. The contracting architecture had been built slowly and painfully. The earliest arrangements were ad hoc, a single contractor bearing the entire burden of feeding the fleet, with predictable results. Dennis Gaudin held the victualling contract after the Restoration in 1660 and found himself chronically underpaid, unable to source quality provisions reliably, and slowly sliding toward bankruptcy as the Navy's debts mounted. Samuel Pepys, who had more respect for administrative order than almost anyone else in Restoration England, watched the system buckle and concluded that single contractor monopoly was fundamentally unsuitable for an institution of the Navy's scale. The Victualling Board, established in 1683 as a permanent state body to manage food supply, was his answer, though Pepys himself would not survive long enough in office to see it mature into the efficient machine it eventually became. The board's method was competitive tendering. Contracts were advertised, bids submitted in sealed envelopes, and the lowest qualifying offer accepted. No single contractor held a monopoly on any major commodity. The board deliberately split large contracts between multiple suppliers simultaneously, so that if one failed, through bankruptcy, bad harvests, or supply disruption, the shortfall could be absorbed by the others. It was a hedge system designed not for the cheapest possible price in any single transaction, but for the most reliable delivery across the long run of a war. Thomas Pinkerton, who held standing contracts for sea provisions at Hull, Leith, Falmouth, and several Caribbean islands, eventually overreached himself and went bankrupt before the Napoleonic Wars ended. The system absorbed his failure without operational consequence, because no single contractor was allowed to become indispensable. The daily ration a British sailor received was generous by any contemporary standard. Each man was entitled to a pound of ship's biscuit and a gallon of beer every day. Across the week, he received 2 pounds of salt beef on 2 days, a pound of salt pork with a pint of peas on 2 more, and oatmeal, butter, and cheese on the remainder. The total came to approximately 5,000 calories, more than most working men on land consumed. The Victualling Board set strict quality standards and audited pursers' accounts with close attention, docking salaries when the figures did not reconcile. The reputation of London-made ship's biscuit, baked multiple times to remove all moisture, hard enough to last months at sea, was considered the finest in the world, and the board's bakeries at Deptford, Portsmouth, and Plymouth produced it in industrial quantities. The guns that a warship carried came from a different part of the supply chain entirely, and it was here that British private enterprise produced one of its most consequential innovations. The Carron Company, an ironworks founded in 1759 on the banks of the River Carron near Falkirk in Scotland, developed a short-barreled cast-iron cannon that became known as the carronade, where a conventional long gun threw a ball at high velocity over long range. The carronade threw a much heavier ball at close range with devastating effect on hull timber and gun crews alike. It weighed roughly a quarter of what an equivalent long gun weighed, required a fraction of the powder charge, and could be operated by a smaller crew. The Admiralty was initially reluctant. The Carron Company had a reputation for commercial sharp practice, but when the weapon proved its worth in action, it was adopted wholesale. French gun foundries could not produce a reliable equivalent for 20 years. The carronade's significance went beyond its ballistic properties. And it was a privately developed weapon, created without any government brief or commission, and adopted by the state because it was manifestly superior to what state arsenals were producing. The pattern repeated itself across the supply chain. Private contractors, motivated by profit and operating under competitive pressure, often innovated faster and more practically than the official establishments could. The rope-making industry that supplied the Navy's cordage was similarly dispersed among private manufacturers competing on price and quality. Their hemp sourced from Russia and processed in rope walks across southern England. The sailcloth that drove the fleet came predominantly from Dorset and Suffolk, woven by manufacturers who had developed the heavy canvas the Navy's specifications required over generations of repeat contracting. The overseas dimension of the supply chain was its most complex and most vulnerable element. A ship on foreign station could not wait for provisions to arrive from Portsmouth. It needed a local solution, and the Victualling Board provided it through a network of agent victuallers stationed at major overseas bases: Gibraltar, Malta, Halifax, Jamaica, Antigua, the Cape, and eventually Rio de Janeiro and Heligoland. Each agent maintained local contracts with suppliers, held reserve stocks, and had authority to purchase in the open market when contract delivery fell short. The system expanded through the Napoleonic Wars as the Navy's geographic reach grew. By 1810, agent victuallers operated at stations across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the South Atlantic, in feeding a fleet whose operational range no previous navy in history had approached. The contrast with French supply arrangements illustrated the advantage Britain had built. The French state managed naval provisioning far more directly, through intendants and official contractors operating under ministerial supervision. The system looked more orderly on paper. In practice, it was less flexible, slower to respond to shortfalls, and more vulnerable to the political disruptions that repeatedly convulsed French administration across the 18th century. French sailors at Brest during the Revolutionary Wars period endured rations that were frequently short in quantity and poor in quality, not because France lacked the resources, but because the administrative chain between resource and sailor had too many fragile links. And British sailors complained constantly about their food. They rarely went without it. By the time of Trafalgar, the British supply chain had been running continuously under wartime pressure for over a decade and had developed a resilience that was institutional rather than improvised. Contractors knew what the Navy needed because they had been supplying it for years. The Victualling Board knew which contractors could be trusted because their accounts had been audited repeatedly. Agent victuallers overseas had established relationships with local suppliers that allowed rapid restocking after a fleet action. The chain from a Suffolk sailcloth weaver to a gun crew loading a carronade off Cape Trafalgar was long, complicated, and never entirely smooth. But it held battle after battle, year after year, in a way that no rival Navy's supply system could match. A warship needed far more men than it needed to simply sail. The crew size of a Royal Navy vessel was set not by the demands of seamanship, but by the demands of the guns. A 74-gun ship of the line required around 600 men to fight effectively, roughly 4 times the number needed to handle her sails and rigging in any weather. In peacetime, the Navy kept perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 men on its books. At the height of the Napoleonic Wars, it needed 140,000. The gap between those two figures was the manning problem, and it was the most persistent, most intractable institutional challenge the Navy faced across the entire 18th century. Voluntary enlistment filled part of the gap. Merchant seamen, fishermen, and men from the coastal towns enlisted for the bounty money, for the prize money that a successful cruise might generate, and sometimes simply because the alternatives ashore were worse. The Navy's food, whatever its reputation, was more regular and more plentiful than what most laborers ate on land. Pay, before the deductions, was not contemptible. An able seaman received 24 shillings a month in the 1790s, more than a farm laborer could expect. At the start of a war, when the bounties were high and the excitement of the thing had not yet worn thin, volunteers came forward in reasonable numbers. They were never enough. The press gang filled the rest, and it did so by legal compulsion that sat awkwardly alongside every principle of English liberty its contemporaries could articulate. The Crown had claimed the right to impress men for naval service since at least the 13th century, and Parliament had confirmed and refined it through a series of acts in 1703, 1705, 1740, and 1779. That specified who could be taken and under what circumstances. In theory, only seafaring men between 18 and 55 were liable. In practice, the impress service, activated at the outbreak of each war, took what it could find. A press gang was a group of 10 to 12 men led by an officer with a warrant. They moved through the streets of port towns after dark, boarded merchant ships in harbor, and occasionally swept coastal villages in the early hours of the morning, leaving behind households that would not see their men again for years. You could be walking home from work along the Portsmouth waterfront and be taken before you reached your door. A naval officer with a warrant needed no further authority. The law gave him your body. Resistance was assault on an officer of the crown, which meant prosecution, though juries frequently acquitted men who had fought back, and local magistrates who were supposed to support the press often obstructed it openly. The Admiralty described the whole process as odious and inefficient, even while depending on it absolutely. At the peak of the Napoleonic Wars, over half the men in the Royal Navy had been pressed. The Quota Acts of 1795 added a different mechanism to the mix. Each county and major town was assigned a number of men to provide for naval service. Now, with the size of the quota set, according to population, and the number of seamen the area was presumed to hold, the intention was to generate volunteers through local bounties rather than compulsion. The result was partly unintended. Many of the men delivered under the quota system were not seamen at all, but debtors, vagrants, petty criminals, and men whose parishes were glad to be rid of them. They arrived on ships knowing nothing of the sea and having to be trained from scratch, and their presence alongside genuine pressed seamen and volunteers created a lower deck that was more socially heterogeneous and more volatile than anything the Navy had previously managed. The world below decks was not the brutal dungeon of popular imagination, but it was not comfortable either. A man's sleeping space was a canvas hammock slung from a hook in the beam above the gun deck, with 14 inches of width allocated per man in the regulations, a figure that presumed, with optimistic arithmetic, that half the crew would always be on watch and the hammocks could be staggered. The mess deck, where men ate, was the same space where the guns stood. 8 men formed a mess, taking turns to cook their rations in the galley forward and bringing the food aft to eat at a table rigged between the guns. They lived, ate, slept, and worked within a few feet of each other for months or years at a stretch, and the social world of a mess, its hierarchies, its loyalties, its humor, its grievances, was the real texture of a sailor's life. Disease killed far more men than battle throughout the period. In the West Indies especially, the yellow fever and dysentery moved through ships' crews with a speed and lethality that no commander could plan around. It was said that 19 men in 20 who died in the Caribbean station died of fever and flux rather than enemy action. Scurvy, the wasting disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, which rotted the gums, opened old wounds, and killed slowly, had been a plague of long voyages since the first oceanic expeditions. James Lind, a Royal Navy physician, demonstrated the remedy definitively in 1747 when he showed that citrus juice cured scurvy patients within days. The Admiralty took nearly 50 years to act on his findings, issuing lemon juice to the fleet as a standard ration from 1795. The French Navy was slower still, and its sailors continued to suffer from scurvy through the Napoleonic Wars at rates the British fleet had largely left behind. Pay was the deepest and most persistent grievance below decks, and the Navy managed it with a short-sightedness that bordered on institutional self-harm. Seamen's basic wages had been set in 1653 and were not raised for 144 years. As prices rose across the 18th century, the real value of naval pay fell steadily. The Navy withheld 6 months' wages as a matter of policy to discourage desertion, which meant a man could serve a year and see only half his earnings. Pay was frequently months or years in arrears. Wages due to dead men accumulated in dockyard offices while their families waited. The situation was not a secret. Admiral Howe had been warning the Admiralty about accumulating discontent in the Channel Fleet for months before the inevitable happened. In April 1797, 16 ships of the Channel Fleet anchored at Spithead refused to weigh anchor. No violence, no burning of ships. The men continued to maintain their vessels, insisted they would put to sea immediately if the French fleet appeared, and sent elected delegates to negotiate with the Admiralty in a manner so disciplined and organized that it looked less like mutiny than collective bargaining. Their demands were concrete: a pay rise, better food, more shore leave, proper care for the sick and wounded, and the removal of officers known for deliberate cruelty. The Admiralty gave way within weeks. A royal pardon was issued. Pay was raised for the first time in nearly a century and a half. The Spithead Mutiny was over before June. The mutiny at the Nore, which followed in May, was harder and uglier. The sailors there went further, blockading the Thames and cutting off London's trade until the Admiralty, having already conceded at Spithead, refused any additional terms. The movement frayed. Ships slipped away. The ringleader, Richard Parker, was hanged from the yardarm of HMS Sandwich on the 30th of June. 28 of his fellow delegates followed him to the gallows or transportation. The Navy absorbed the crisis, granted what it judged necessary, punished those it judged guilty, and returned to the war, having, in the process, quietly acknowledged that 144 years of wage stagnation had been a mistake that nearly cost it the Channel at the moment France was threatening invasion. And the foreign sailors who served in the Royal Navy are among the least visible figures in its history. Pressed from the merchant fleets of a dozen nations, they crewed British warships in numbers that the Navy was always reluctant to count precisely. Americans were pressed in sufficient numbers to become a diplomatic crisis. The impressment of U.S. citizens was listed among the grievances that triggered the War of 1812. Scandinavians, Dutch, Portuguese, and men from every Atlantic port filled the lower decks alongside their British messmates, learned the same routines, ate the same food, fought the same battles, and in many cases never went home. The Navy that fought at Trafalgar was not purely British. It was what 140,000 men drawn from across the maritime world looked like when placed inside an institution disciplined enough to make them a fleet. A boy who wanted to become a Royal Navy officer began, in the 18th century, by going to sea. There were no naval academies in England of any consequence for most of the period, no classroom preparation, no formal curriculum that had to be completed before a young man could present himself at the quarterdeck. The path was the ship. Boys as young as 9 or 10 joined as captain's servants or first-class volunteers, lived in the gunroom, learned the ropes in the most literal sense, and watched the officers above them closely enough to understand, through repetition rather than instruction, how a warship was worked and fought. After several years of this, a boy might be rated midshipman, which gave him a uniform and permission to walk the quarterdeck, but not yet a commission. He was still learning. He would be learning for years. The path to lieutenant required 6 years of documented sea service, a minimum age of 20, and a formal examination before a board of 3 senior captains who would quiz the candidate on seamanship, navigation, and the management of a vessel under a range of conditions. The examination was genuinely demanding. Some candidates failed repeatedly. Others passed, but had to wait years for a commission because the peacetime Navy had more passed midshipmen than it had lieutenants' billets to fill them. A man could spend his mid-20s and early 30s in professional limbo, qualified, experienced, drawing half pay, waiting for a war to open the door. When war came, it opened fast. When peace returned, it shut with equal speed, and the careers of whole cohorts stalled on the waiting list simultaneously. Horatio Nelson's path through the system illustrated both its strengths and its contradictions. He joined the Navy in January 1771 at the age of 12 aboard HMS Raisonnable, whose captain was his maternal uncle, Maurice Suckling. His entry was arranged, his early postings managed, and his first examination board, the one that certified him as a lieutenant in April 1777, included Suckling himself, by then the comptroller of the Navy Board. Nelson was not yet 19, below the minimum qualifying age of 20, and this was quietly overlooked. He received his commission the following day and sailed for Jamaica within weeks. By 20, he was a post captain. The patronage that accelerated his rise was neither unusual nor considered improper in context. It was how the system worked for those who had the right connections. Patronage in the Royal Navy was not the same thing as incompetence, and the distinction mattered. An admiral who sponsored a protege was staking his own reputation on that officer's performance. Poor captains reflected badly on the men who had vouched for them, which gave patrons a real incentive to sponsor only those whose abilities they could genuinely defend. The result, across the officer corps as a whole, was a system that was socially unequal in its entry conditions but broadly functional in its outcomes. Connected officers, on average, performed better in battle than unconnected ones, not because connection conferred skill, but because the selection process, however imperfect, tended to bring forward men whose family networks had already exposed them to serious naval environments. Nelson's uncle had put him in the right ships. The ships had done the rest. What the midshipman system produced over years and decades was an officer class with an unusually deep practical foundation. By the time a man held his first independent command, he had almost certainly served through Atlantic storms, equatorial calms, Caribbean cruises, and the particular violence of fleet engagements at close range. He had navigated by dead reckoning across open ocean, managed exhausted crews in foul weather, and made decisions about sail and helm under conditions where a wrong answer had immediate physical consequences. The intellectual dimension of the profession, navigation mathematics, chart reading, and signals procedure, was absorbed alongside the physical, not separately from it. French officers trained at formal academies were often technically brilliant, but sometimes lacked the ingrained reflexes that came from years of sea experience before command. The culture that the British officer corps developed across the 18th century was defined above all by a tolerance for independent action. The Royal Navy's tactical doctrine, embodied in its fighting instructions, prescribed the line of battle as the standard form of fleet engagement, and admirals were expected to maintain it. But captains and subordinate commanders at sea were frequently too far from their admiral to receive signals, or facing situations the fighting instructions did not anticipate. And the institutional culture rewarded the man who judged the moment correctly and acted on his own authority rather than waiting for orders that might never come. The court-martials of the period reflected this. Officers were more often censured for failing to engage than for engaging too aggressively. The message was consistent across decades. Hesitation was the greater sin. The contrast with the French officer corps was sharpest at the level of tactical philosophy. French naval doctrine in the 18th century favored a defensive posture. Preserve the fleet, protect the convoy, avoid decisive engagement unless the odds were clearly favorable. It was a rational strategy for a navy that was chronically underfunded and undercrewed, and it produced skilled individual ship handlers who were cautious, methodical, and difficult to bring to a reckoning. It also produced an officer class that was not accustomed to thinking offensively, and when offensive action was required, the habit was not there. British captains, raised on a culture that expected them to close and engage, brought a different kind of readiness to every encounter. The difference was not courage. Both navies produced brave men. The difference was expectation. What an officer had been trained by culture as much as instruction to do when the moment came. The French Revolution destroyed what the French Naval Officer Corps had spent a century building. In 1781, the Ségur Ordinance had already closed officer appointments to all but those able to prove 4 generations of nobility, so locking experienced commoners out and deepening the resentment between the old and new noble families within the officer class. When the Revolution came, the settlement was catastrophic. Noble officers emigrated in large numbers after 1789. Those who remained faced the reign of terror, and many of the best were guillotined or driven into exile. The sailors, who had long resented the aristocratic officer class, were in many cases willing participants in the purge. By the mid-1790s, the French Navy had lost the great majority of its experienced sea commanders and was replacing them with men who had never commanded in fleet action. The damage took 20 years to partially repair, and the Napoleonic Wars ended before the repair was complete. What Britain had built in its officer corps by 1805 was not a collection of geniuses. Nelson was exceptional, and everyone knew it. His appetite for risk, his gift for tactical improvisation, his ability to communicate his intentions to subordinates without detailed orders, were qualities that set him apart from his contemporaries as clearly as they set him apart from his opponents. But the fleet that followed him into action at Trafalgar was not dependent on his genius to function. Its captains had spent their professional lives in a culture that rewarded aggression, trusted independent judgment, and treated hesitation as the more dangerous option. When Nelson was struck down at the height of the battle and carried below to die, the fleet he commanded did not falter. It continued fighting, pressing the action, taking prizes, and prevailing, because the institution had made the same officer in different forms and 27 times over. France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic did not fail for lack of trying. Each of them, at various points in the 17th and 18th centuries, mounted serious efforts to build and sustain a naval force capable of challenging Britain at sea. France poured money into it under Colbert, and again under the reforming ministers of the 1780s. Spain rebuilt its entire fleet under the Bourbon monarchs of the mid-18th century, and, at its peak, held the third largest navy in the world. The Dutch had created modern naval warfare almost from scratch in the preceding century. The failure of all three was not a failure of ambition. It was a failure of the systems that were supposed to sustain ambition across decades, through peace and war, through fiscal crisis and political upheaval, now through every disruption that a century of hard competition could produce. France came closest. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who served Louis XIV as Minister of Finance and Secretary of State for the Navy from the 1660s, built the French fleet from almost nothing into a force of over 120 ships of the line within 20 years. He founded Rochefort as a new naval base, expanded Brest and Toulon, established schools for officers and navigators, created the inscription Maritime to register and conscript French seamen, and planted forests specifically for future naval timber, calculating with characteristic precision that the trees going into the ground in the 1670s would be ready for shipwrights around 1750. The fleet he built was real, serious, and for a decade, the largest in Europe. It did not survive him, and as Colbert died in 1683, his son Seignelay held the ministry for a few years more, but the financial pressures of Louis XIV's wars ground the Navy down steadily after the 9 Years' War began in 1688. The fleet had scored a famous victory at Beachy Head in 1690. The French actually controlled the English Channel briefly, an achievement never repeated. But 2 years later, a crushing defeat at Barfleur-la-Hougue cost France 12 ships of the line and broke the offensive momentum of the fleet permanently. Louis XIV switched strategy. Rather than maintaining the expensive battle fleet, he turned to guerre de course, privateer warfare, commerce raiding, attacking British merchant shipping rather than fighting the Royal Navy in open battle. Jean Bart and René Duguay-Trouin became heroes of this approach. It damaged British trade severely. It could not threaten British sea control. The financial collapse that followed Louis XIV's wars was decisive in its long-term consequences for French naval power. The French treasury by 1715 owed debts accumulated across decades of land warfare and the simultaneous attempt to maintain both a large army and a serious fleet. The Navy was expendable in a way the Army was not. France's land borders required soldiers continuously, while ships could at least be laid up. During the regency that followed Louis XIV's death, the French fleet was left to rot. Ships that Colbert's craftsmen had built with painstaking care sat at their moorings for years without maintenance, their hulls softening, their rigging deteriorating, their guns corroding. The institutional knowledge of the officers and men who had built the fleet's competence dispersed with equal speed. By the time serious reform was attempted again in the 1740s, an entire generation of experienced sea service had been lost. The cycle repeated itself with dismal consistency. France reformed its navy, built a credible fleet, committed it to war, lost heavily, faced fiscal crisis, and allowed the institution to decay until the next reforming minister arrived to start again. Each cycle began from a lower base than the last, because the institutional memory lost in each period of neglect took longer to rebuild than any minister's tenure lasted. The reforming dicasteries expanded Brest impressively in the 1780s, modernized officer training, and produced some of the finest individual ship designs in Europe. French warships were often technically superior to British ones, hull for hull. Then, the Revolution came. The officer corps emigrated or went to the guillotine. The sailors mutinied. The dockyards emptied of experienced craftsmen. Everything de Castries had built was dismantled inside 5 years, not by a foreign enemy, but by France's own political convulsion. Spain's situation was different in character, but similar in outcome. The Spanish Empire stretched from Peru to the Philippines, and the distances involved in defending it shaped Spanish naval thinking in a way that made fleet battle a secondary concern. Spanish warships needed endurance for transoceanic patrol more than they needed the shallow draft agility suited to channel engagements. The Havana Dockyard, established in the 1720s, built ships from Cuban cedar and tropical hardwoods that were genuinely exceptional. The Santísima Trinidad, the largest warship in the world at Trafalgar, was Havana-built. But Spanish naval thinking was perpetually divided between Atlantic and Pacific commitments, between colonial defense and European politics, in a way that prevented the fleet from ever being concentrated and developed for a single strategic purpose. Under Carlos III, who reigned from 1759 to 1788, Spain mounted a serious naval modernization program that briefly made its fleet a genuine threat. The number of ships of the line grew from around 40 to over 70. Naval architecture was reformed by Jorge Juan, who had studied British and French methods and introduced their improvements. The officer corps was reorganized and a naval academy established at Cadiz. By the late 1770s, Spain was capable of mounting effective combined operations with France. The Siege of Gibraltar from 1779 to 1783 was the largest military operation in the Atlantic world of the century, and Spain's logistical management of it demonstrated a degree of naval organization that the standard Anglo-centric history of the period undervalues significantly. What Spain could not manage was the sustained, continuous investment that converted periodic competence into permanent institutional strength. The financial resources of the empire were vast on paper, but chronically difficult to extract and deliver. Silver from Potosi had to cross the Atlantic before it could fund a dockyard at Ferrol. Now, the convoy system that protected that silver, the flota, consumed naval resources even as it generated the revenue that paid for them. When the convoys ran late or were lost or were blockaded, the effect rippled immediately through naval expenditure. The Treaty of San Ildefonso of 1796, which bound Spain to France in alliance against Britain, committed the Spanish fleet to a war it was structurally unprepared for against an enemy that had spent the preceding decade blockading, wearing down, and demoralizing the very fleet now ordered to fight it. Yellow fever took a catastrophic toll on Spanish crews in the years before Trafalgar, killing men the dockyard system could not quickly replace. The Dutch Republic's trajectory was the most poignant of the three. Because the Dutch had genuinely created the world Britain was now dominating. They had pioneered the joint stock company, the bond market, the deep-water merchant fleet, and much of the tactical doctrine of fleet warfare that the Royal Navy had absorbed and built upon. At the peak of Dutch power in the 1660s, their merchant fleet numbered 10,000 vessels. Their warships had raided the Medway and towed the Royal Charles out of her own anchorage. Their admirals, De Ruyter, Tromp, were the finest sea commanders of their generation. Britain had learned naval warfare in part by fighting the Dutch, and what it had learned, it had institutionalized. The Dutch had not. Dutch naval power began declining around 1714 and never recovered its 17th century position. The commercial republic that had generated the wealth to build the fleet was increasingly eclipsed by London's financial markets. Amsterdam's great merchant families began depositing their capital in British government bonds rather than Dutch ventures, a quiet transfer of financial confidence that gradually hollowed out the republic's economic base. By 1780, when Britain declared war over Dutch trade with the American rebels, the Dutch Navy had only 20 ships of the line. Britain captured key Dutch colonial possessions across the East and West Indies within a year and blockaded the Dutch coast with almost casual ease. When the war ended in 1784, the Dutch Republic was at the lowest point of its power and prestige in more than a century. And the political instability that followed led within a decade to French occupation and the end of the Republic itself. What separated Britain from all three rivals was not the presence of any single advantage, but the absence of a fatal weakness. France had the resources, but not the financial continuity. Spain had the empire, but not the strategic coherence. The Dutch had the tradition, but not the capacity to sustain it through a century of escalating competition against a rival that was compounding its institutional advantages with every passing decade. Britain's constitutional settlement, its credit system, its dockyard infrastructure, its officer culture, and its supply chain each reinforced the others in a way that made the whole system more resilient than any of its individual components. Yet none of Britain's rivals had built anything comparable. By the time the Napoleonic Wars began, they were not competing against a navy. They were competing against a machine. The Royal Navy did not arrive at Trafalgar fully formed. It was made by war, by the specific, often brutal experience of fighting France, Spain, and the Dutch across three major conflicts between 1756 and 1802, losing some of them, nearly losing others, and rebuilding after each one with sharper understanding of what had gone wrong. The 7 Years' War, the American War of Independence, and the French Revolutionary Wars were not interruptions to the Navy's development. They were the mechanism of it. Each conflict forced the institution to confront its own limitations under the only conditions that reveal such things clearly. When an enemy is trying to destroy you. The 7 Years' War, which ran from 1756 to 1763, was the first conflict in which British naval strategy operated at genuinely global scale. William Pitt the Elder, who directed the war from London, grasped something that previous ministers had not articulated clearly. Naval supremacy was not an end in itself, but the lever by which Britain could reach French colonial possessions in Canada, the Caribbean, and India, while keeping its own army commitments in Europe relatively modest. The formula worked. Wolfe took Quebec in September 1759. The Caribbean islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique fell. French India was effectively ended as a strategic entity. And all of it was enabled by the blockade of Brest and Toulon, which prevented France from reinforcing any of these theaters by sea. The centerpiece of that blockade strategy was the destruction of the French Atlantic Fleet at Quiberon Bay on the 20th of November, 1759. The French Admiral Conflans had assembled 21 ships of the line and was making for the Breton coast to rendezvous with an invasion force aimed at Scotland. Hawke had been watching Brest for months. When a gale drove his fleet briefly off station and gave Conflans his opening, Hawke came back hard, caught the French fleet off the entrance to the bay, and followed them in when Conflans sought shelter among the rocks and shoals, counting on the British refusing to risk their hulls in unfamiliar waters. His sailing master warned that the sea ahead was littered with reefs. Hawke told him that where there was passage for the enemy, there was passage for him. The French fleet was shattered before darkness fell. 2 British ships grounded on the outer reefs. 7 French ships were sunk, captured, or driven aground, and another 8 were trapped in the estuary of the Vilaine for months. The threat of invasion dissolved overnight. Quiberon Bay ended the 7 Years' War as a naval competition, though the treaty did not come until 1763. Its deeper significance was institutional. Hawke had shown what a sustained close blockade could accomplish, starving the enemy fleet of sea time, keeping its crews untrained and its officers uninitiated, and then destroying it when it finally ventured out into conditions its men were no longer fit to manage. The lesson was not forgotten. Hawke became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1766 and spent his tenure embedding the blockade doctrine into the Navy's strategic thinking as a permanent method, not a wartime expedient. When the next Great War came, the institution already knew what to do. The American War of Independence, which drew in France in 1778 and Spain in 1779, exposed weaknesses that Quiberon Bay had obscured. Britain suddenly faced a coalition of naval powers whose combined strength in ships of the line rivaled its own, fighting across an oceanic theater without the geographic concentration that had made the 7 Years' War manageable. The Royal Navy was spread between the Channel, the North Sea, Gibraltar, the Caribbean, the North American seaboard, and eventually Indian waters, and it could not be strong everywhere at once. That the stretched deployment left gaps. It was in one of those gaps that the war was lost. On the 5th of September 1781, a British fleet of 19 ships of the line under Admiral Thomas Graves met a French fleet of 24 ships under the Comte de Grasse at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay. Graves needed to break through to relieve Cornwallis at Yorktown. He failed to press the action decisively, broke off the engagement after 2 hours of inconclusive fighting, and withdrew to New York. De Grasse kept the bay. With no possibility of relief or resupply by sea, Cornwallis surrendered on the 19th of October. The world had turned upside down, as the British Army Band reportedly played during the ceremony, and the cause was not French genius or American bravery alone. It was a single afternoon of insufficient aggression by a British admiral who hesitated when the moment required him to do otherwise. The loss of America taught the Navy lessons. It was better for having learned when the stakes were a set of colonies rather than the home islands. The single admiral command structure, which had concentrated too much decision-making in officers who were too far from the action, was quietly reformed. Lord Howe, who took command of the Channel Fleet in 1782, developed a new signals code that gave subordinate commanders clearer and more flexible instructions during battle, allowing fleet engagements to be directed and redirected in real time rather than through pre-battle orders that could not account for the chaos of actual combat. The signals book Howe produced in 1790 was a direct product of the American War's failures. Nelson would build on it at Trafalgar. The French Revolutionary Wars, which began in 1793, confronted the Navy with the full consequences of the Revolution's destruction of French naval competence alongside a renewed and initially serious French challenge. The early years were harder than later mythology suggests. At the glorious 1st of June in 1794, Howe won a tactical victory over the French fleet in the Atlantic, but failed to intercept the grain convoy the fleet had been covering, which reached Brest safely and fed a republic on the edge of famine. The French called it a strategic success. Both sides were right. The Navy was learning, in real time, that winning battles was not the same as achieving strategic objectives, and that a blockade maintained was worth more than a victory that left the enemy's ports open. The year 1797 was the Navy's worst since the Medway. The Spithead and Nore mutinies paralyzed the Channel Fleet at the moment France was planning invasion, and Spain and the Dutch had joined the war against Britain. Had the mutinies coincided with a French fleet sortie, the consequences were almost unthinkable. They did not, partly because the French were unable to coordinate their own movements, and partly because the British crews, for all their grievances, had made clear they would fight if the enemy appeared. The crisis passed. Pay was raised, and within weeks of the Nore settlement, Admiral Jervis destroyed a Spanish fleet more than twice his size at Cape St. Vincent, and Admiral Duncan annihilated the Dutch fleet at Camperdown. The Navy had come closer to collapse than its later reputation suggests, and had come out the other side more experienced for the proximity. The brief Peace of Amiens, which lasted from 1802 to 1803, gave both navies a moment to breathe and reorganize. Napoleon used it to rebuild French naval ambitions, appointing Denis de Creye as Minister of Marine, and laying down an ambitious program of new ship construction. He understood, with characteristic clarity, that Britain could not be defeated on land, and that the only path to ending the war was to neutralize the Navy long enough to land an army in England. The program he launched was real and substantial. By 1805, France and its allies had enough ships of the line on paper to match the Royal Navy. On paper, the years of blockade, the Revolution's decimation of experienced officers, and the structural weaknesses in French dockyard supply meant that many of those ships were undermanned, poorly stored, and crewed by men who had spent the peace in harbor rather than at sea. The Royal Navy emerged from its 3 wars not simply larger, but fundamentally different in character from the institution that had entered the 7 Years' War 50 years earlier. Its officers had developed a blockade doctrine refined through a century of practice. Its dockyard system had been stress-tested through 2 decades of near-continuous war and had held. Its finance system had borrowed and spent on a scale that would have bankrupted any rival and was still borrowing at 3%. Its crews had mutinied, been heard, been partially appeased, and had gone back to work. Every failure, the Chesapeake, the American War, yet the 1st of June's missed convoy, had produced a response, a reformed signals code, a revised strategy, a better trained officer corps. The machine was not perfect. It had never been perfect, but it had been at war on and off for 50 years, and it had learned from every minute of it. In the autumn of 1805, the Royal Navy had over 700 ships in commission across every ocean in the world. Its home waters alone held more than 100 ships of the line, deployed on the blockade lines that had been holding French and Spanish ports sealed for the better part of 2 years. The men who crewed them had not seen their families in months, sometimes years. They lived on salt meat and biscuit, slept in hammocks 14 inches wide, and drilled at their guns on a schedule set by captains who understood that the margin between a well-practiced gun crew and a poorly practiced one could be measured in survival. They were not volunteers. Most of them had not chosen to be there. But they were the most experienced body of seamen afloat anywhere in the world, and their experience had been purchased by the blockade itself. The blockade was the foundation of everything. A fleet that spent months at sea in all weathers, navigating the Bay of Biscay in winter and the Atlantic approaches in summer, developed a seamanship that harbor-bound fleets simply could not replicate. Every storm the Channel Fleet weathered off Ushant, every gale that drove the Mediterranean squadron off Toulon and forced it back against the wind, was a training exercise that no admiral could have designed more effectively. The French and Spanish crews in Brest, Cadiz, and Rochefort sat in port while this was happening, their skills eroding, their confidence in heavy weather sailing quietly diminishing. When they finally put to sea, they faced men who had been living at sea continuously. The gap between those 2 states of readiness was not visible on any order of battle. It decided Trafalgar anyway. The gunnery advantage the Royal Navy carried into Trafalgar was built from the same source: British gun crews fired 2 to 3 broadsides in 5 minutes. French and Spanish crews typically took twice as long for a single aimed broadside. Part of this was tactical philosophy. French doctrine aimed at rigging and masts. The British doctrine aimed at hulls and gun crews. But part of it was simply practice, the accumulated muscle memory of men who had drilled at their pieces week after week in all weather while their opponents had not. The British had also adopted the gun lock, a flintlock firing mechanism fitted to the breech of each cannon, which allowed a gun captain to fire precisely as the ship rolled into alignment with the enemy. French warships at Trafalgar had still not universally adopted it. The difference in rate of fire across an engagement lasting several hours was not marginal. It was catastrophic for the receiving end. The copper sheathing on British hulls was a technical advantage the French had struggled to fully replicate for 20 years. First introduced during the American War, the process involved covering a ship's entire underwater hull with thin sheets of copper, which prevented the growth of weed and the boring of shipworm, kept the hull clean and fast through long voyages, and extended the time between essential dockings. A coppered hull could stay at sea far longer than an uncoppered one without losing speed. The implications for blockade strategy were direct. British ships could maintain station continuously that French ships had to abandon every few months for careening or docking. By 1805, the entire battle fleet was coppered. Many French ships were not, and those that were had done it with less consistency and at greater cost. The man commanding the combined fleet at Cadiz in October 1805 understood most of this clearly. Pierre-Charles Villeneuve had watched the French fleet destroyed at the Nile in 1798 from close range. He had commanded one of the ships that escaped, and he had no illusions about what awaited him if he took his fleet to sea against Nelson. He convened a council of war aboard his flagship Bucentaure on the 8th of October and heard his own captains, French and Spanish alike, argue for remaining in port. He agreed with them. He then received a letter informing him that a replacement admiral was already in Madrid, sent by Napoleon to relieve him of command. Villeneuve ordered the fleet to sea on the 18th. He was sailing not toward a battle he expected to win, but away from a humiliation he could not endure. His fleet of 33 ships cleared Cadiz in light winds over 2 days and turned south. Nelson had been watching from beyond the horizon with 27 ships. He had kept his fleet out of sight of the port deliberately, using frigates as scouts, unwilling to let Villeneuve see the force waiting for him and decide to stay in harbor. His plan, communicated to his captains in a memorandum written aboard Victory 10 days before the battle, dispensed with the conventional line of battle entirely. 2 columns would attack at right angles to the enemy line, breaking it in at least 2 places, creating a melee of individual ship actions in which British gunnery, British seamanship, and British officers trained to act without waiting for orders would overwhelm opponents who had none of those advantages in equal measure. His captains had been briefed so thoroughly that on the morning of the action, when he hoisted his famous signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty," one of them remarked that they all knew their duty well enough already, and the signal was unnecessary. It was hoisted anyway. The battle lasted from just before noon until the guns fell silent at 5:30. By then, 17 enemy ships had been captured and 1 burned. Not a single British ship had been lost. 449 British sailors were dead and 1,214 wounded. The combined fleet had lost over 4,000 killed, nearly 3,000 wounded, and close to 20,000 taken prisoner. The disproportion was not the product of Nelson's genius alone, though his genius was real. It was the accumulated product of coppered hulls that had kept station for 2 years, gun crews that had drilled while their opponents had not, officers trained from boyhood in a culture that rewarded aggression, supply lines that had kept 100 ships at sea without a single day's starvation, and a financial system that had borrowed the money to build and maintain every piece of it at 3% interest while France paid double. Nelson was carried below at around 1:30 in the afternoon, shot through the left shoulder by a musket ball from the mizzen top of the Redoubtable. The ball passed through his lung and lodged in his spine. He died at 4:30, about an hour before the last guns fell silent, knowing the battle was won. The fleet he left behind him continued fighting without pause. His second-in-command, Cuthbert Collingwood, assumed control seamlessly. The captains carried out the plan they had already internalized. The institution functioned after its commander died because it had been built to function that way, not around a single man's presence, but around a shared understanding of what was required, drilled into every officer who had come up through the same midshipman berths, the same examinations, the same culture of aggressive, independent action that the Navy had been developing across a century of trial and near disaster. The storm that came 3 days after Trafalgar wrecked or sank most of the prizes, and the fleet that limped into Gibraltar and Portsmouth in the following weeks looked nothing like a force in triumph. The men were exhausted. The ships were battered. Nelson was dead, his body preserved in a cask of brandy for the voyage home. Yet the loss of him felt across the fleet in a way that had no precedent in British naval history. What had been won was not celebrated easily or at length, and the tears in London on the morning of the 6th of November, when the news reached the Admiralty, were not entirely for joy. But the strategic fact was settled, and everyone understood it. No French fleet would challenge the Royal Navy again for the remainder of the war. The sea was Britain's, not because of the battle, but because of everything that had been built to make the battle possible. The question that the preceding century answers is not why Britain won at Trafalgar. By October 1805, that outcome was close to predetermined. The real question is why Britain, alone among the European powers, it managed to build and sustain the institutional machinery that made Trafalgar's outcome almost inevitable decades before the battle was fought. The answer is not national character. It is not seafaring tradition, which several rival powers shared in equal or greater measure. It is not the genius of individual commanders, though genius was present. It is something more structural, more durable, and more transferable than any of those explanations. And it begins with the relationship between money and accountability. France's central problem was that its state could not be trusted to repay its debts. This was not a moral failing, but a structural one. An absolute monarchy that could borrow without parliamentary oversight could also repudiate without parliamentary consequence. Louis XIV had done it. His successors had done it. Each repudiation reduced the willingness of lenders to extend credit at acceptable rates, which forced the state to borrow through intermediaries at higher cost, which deepened the fiscal crisis that made repudiation tempting in the first place. The cycle was self-reinforcing and essentially inescapable within the parameters of absolute monarchy. Britain's constitutional settlement of 1689 broke that cycle by binding the government's credit to parliamentary authority, an authority that represented the very class of merchants and landowners whose capital was being borrowed. The result was the lowest sovereign borrowing rates in Europe and the capacity to fund a war fleet on a scale no absolute monarchy could match across the long run. Spain's problem was different. The empire that was supposed to fund the navy also consumed it. Every silver convoy that crossed the Atlantic required escort. Every Caribbean island required garrisoning. Every Pacific route required patrol. The fleet that Spain needed to defend its empire was perpetually diverted by the empire's own defensive requirements, leaving insufficient resources to develop and sustain a fleet capable of meeting Britain in open battle on even terms. The Bourbon reforms of the mid-18th century came closer to solving this than is generally acknowledged, but they arrived too late and depended too heavily on a single capable monarch to outlast him. When Carlos III died in 1788 and the French Revolutionary Wars pulled Spain into alliance with a collapsing French naval system, the window closed permanently. The Dutch case was the most instructive, because the Dutch had built everything Britain later replicated: the bond market, the merchant fleet, the joint stock company, the tactical doctrine, and still lost the competition. What the Dutch Republic lacked was the political capacity to convert commercial wealth into sustained military investment. The Republic's federal structure, in which 7 provinces each retained substantial sovereignty, made centralized military spending a permanent political negotiation rather than an executive decision. Naval funding was perennially contested between the maritime provinces, which paid for it, and the land provinces, which benefited from it. Britain's parliament, for all its obstructionism, could eventually be brought to fund the Navy through the straightforward argument that British commerce, and with it the wealth of every merchant sitting in the commons, depended on sea control. The Dutch equivalent of that argument was perpetually lost in interprovincial rivalry. What Britain had, and what none of its rivals managed to build, was a system in which the incentives of the governing class aligned with the requirements of naval power. The merchants who sat in Parliament needed the Navy to protect their trade routes. The landowners who sat alongside them needed the Navy to prevent invasion and preserve the social order that their estates required. The bankers who lent to the government needed the Navy to win wars, because winning wars validated the credit they had extended and promised a return on the bonds they held. Naval spending was not an imposition on the British political class. It was an investment that the same class made in its own interests, which meant it was defended, sustained, and renewed across decades in a way that no rival's naval program ever was. The dockyards, the timber supply chains, the officer corps, the contractor networks, and the victualling system each reflected this fundamental alignment. None of them were perfect. All of them were contested, corrupt in places, inefficient in others, and periodically subject to the kind of parliamentary parsimony that left ships rotting and men unpaid. But they were never abandoned, because the people with the power to abandon them were also the people with the most to lose by doing so. France's naval establishment depended on royal will, which was inconsistent, and Spain's depended on imperial revenue, which was unreliable. Britain's depended on the self-interest of its governing class, which was, if nothing else, entirely consistent. Napoleon understood this clearly and said so. He knew that Britain could not be defeated on land, that the Channel was a permanent obstacle his army could not cross while the Royal Navy held it, and that the only path to victory ran through the destruction of British sea power. He spent the years between 1803 and 1805 trying to assemble a fleet large enough and a strategy sophisticated enough to achieve it. He failed, as his admirals had warned him he would, because he was trying to solve in 3 years a problem that Britain had been solving for a century. The ships could be built, the timber could be sourced, the men could be pressed or conscripted. But the institutional depth, the accumulated experience of the dockyards, the ingrained culture of the officer corps, the financial architecture that kept the whole machine funded through every crisis, could not be improvised or replicated on a deadline. It had to be grown, and it had taken Britain 100 years to grow it. That is what Trafalgar was actually about. Not a battle, a century.